All right, so we're going to start off, we're going to go back to 1921, before the Charter Committee formed to reform the city's charter. And here's what the voter turnout for that election was in 1921. Now, there's Cincinnati in 1921. All right, so our voter makeup at this time in 1921, there were 32 seats on council. 26 were wards and 6 were at large. So we had the turnout that year, we had 68,000 Republicans. Could you imagine that many people voting in the election now? 68,000 Republicans and 61,000 Democrats. Now granted, the Cincinnati's population was much bigger than what it is today, but still the turnout was significantly higher. So that was the breakdown of voter makeup. How do you think the election turned out? This was the election results because there were so many Republicans who voted. Of the 32 seats, 26 wards, 6 at large, there were 31 Republicans in office and 1 Democrat. And then after seeing these election results, I realized why I was asked to speak today. Because 100 years after this in 2021, that was basically what happened in the city of Cincinnati with me as the 1 Republican, 1 Charterite. And so what you saw here is just a slight majority, yet a super-majority in office. And that in itself shows you the problem with a plurality voting. And this is what really fueled the decision to put in proportional representation into the charter reform for the city of Cincinnati. So I want to go back. I want to know, does anybody in here think that looks like democracy? Do you know what our friend Charlie Taft had to say about this? It's not democracy. It may be tyranny. His words, not mine. Oh, okay. So Charlie Taft's comment after that election, he said, that is not democracy or the rule of the people. It may be tyranny. And then when the Charter Committee decided to put proportional representation on the ballot, this is what Charlie Taft's reflection was on that. He said, there is hardly a supporter of the City Charter Committee today who does not feel that proportional representation is the most important single element in the success of good government in the city, and it must be preserved at all costs. And you saw this in the video, but I wanted to throw it in here again. It's complex when you talk about it, but when you have it in front of you, it's pretty simple. You just have to rank in order, which a lot of kids do in grade school when they're ranking their favorite colors. And this is taken from the Fair Vote website that talks about this to show how easy it is. And when they tested this on grade school kids, they figured it out immediately. It didn't take a lot of explanation or confusion in having to start over so many times. So here's the first election following the new charter in 1925, November 1925. They did the first election with proportional representation, and this is the voter makeup. So we had, and so I have to explain how the parties were set up then. When it says 28% Republican, that was the Republican group that really had the political machine. So the Republican Party was somewhat divided, where you had more what they called independent Republicans that didn't fall in line with the political machine that ran things behind the scenes. And they had independents, they had the Republican machine, and then they had charter. The Democrats did not endorse a ticket that year. They endorsed the charter slate, which included independent Republicans and Democrats. So how do you think it turned out when they had proportional representation?
More proportional.
Similar to 1921 or similar to the 25 voter turnout?
2/3, 1/3.
Yes.
More like this. Wow.
Much better, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you had 3 Republicans that were part of the old establishment, part of the political machine, and you had 6 charterites that included Democrats and independent Republicans. I also wanted to note that I found interesting, in that election, they had 70 candidates pick up petitions. They had 45 actually enter the race. And they had several incumbents from the 32-member previous council, run for office. So that was very different from this past election where there were 10 candidates for 9 seats. So it really did encourage a lot more, and you still ended up, even with that many candidates, you didn't have the vote split to end up still lopsided. You ended up with proportional representation that really matched. And I wanted to give another description of this because I think this really played out well here. Proportional representation is designed to give representation in a legislative body to every group and general thinking alike on political subjects which is considered large enough to deserve representation. So in this case, with just 8% of the electorate being independent, it didn't necessarily warrant to have an independent representative on council, and it ended up being exactly like that. So that year, there were 124,000 people who cast votes, which was 6,000 votes higher than the previous election. And studies show today that proportional representation or ranked choice voting actually brings a higher voter turnout than plurality voting that we have now in Cincinnati and in Ohio. A newspaper reported that no ballot had, even though no ballot had the usual party circle on it, still no voters seemed to have difficulty in the process. And only 3.7% of the ballots were considered invalid because they were done wrong. So only 3.7% were thrown out, compared to Cleveland's 7.6% of the votes thrown out at that election. So still, even though it was so new and not very well known, people were still able to figure it out, and so few votes had to be tossed out because they were done wrong. I also want to note that Cincinnati in the 1925 November election was the largest city in the United States to do proportional representation voting at that time. Pretty significant. We were well ahead of our time. So 3 elections. I believe this was alluded to in the video, or it might have been on something else that I saw over there. But 3 elections after the new charter came into existence, Cincinnati was named the best governed city in the United States. So when they started voting with proportional representation, they had much more effective government. I think that's pretty significant. And this is our friend Charlie Taft again. Democracy, if it means anything in this country, means that the policy approved by the majority must be carried out by the majority. But surely the minority must be given representation and the opportunity for intelligent and restraining criticism. So I thought this quote was very powerful, and it shows in this type of voting that they were able to have minority representation on council to be able to keep the majority in check and to end up with the best governed city in the United States. So the video talked about this as well. In 1959, we had a lot of discrimination and desire for the political domination to come back. And that meant the end of proportional representation in Cincinnati elections. So as the Black population in Cincinnati continued to grow and more were elected onto council, and with the threat, or what some considered to be a threat, of Ted Berry becoming mayor, and the old political machine faction of the Republican Party worked together to be able to take out proportional representation, to go back to plurality voting, to ensure that they continued to get the power again, even with a slight majority, be able to have a super majority on council. But we do know that Ted Berry still persevered and won, and ended up being one of the greatest mayors and leaders of the city. And so here's Ted Berry's comment. He was a strong proponent for proportional representation throughout his career and throughout his life. And he said, PR assured that there would always be an effective and highly visible minority to check the majority in council. And now we do not have that anymore.
That's right.
So I wanted to share some stats. The most recent stats that I have that had the breakdown of the city of Cincinnati and our voters and their political alignment has 15% of the city Republican, 35% of the city independents, and 50% of the city Democrats. So we're really split 50-50 if you kind of break it down into those two groups. But right now, with only 50% of the city, you have 100% of the governing at the city of Cincinnati. And so that means ideologically, 50%, half of the city is not represented on council, which takes us back to where we were 100 years ago. And so now 100 years later, we are exactly where we were. And so now what? So this is where ranked choice voting is, and it's in 60 jurisdictions throughout the country. It's in other countries as well. There's only 2 states that do it for federal elections, and that's Maine and Alaska. And since I studied political science, and so I get to be a political science nerd here for a minute, I think Alaska is one of the most interesting setups. I know I have a friend over here that doesn't necessarily agree with how Alaska is set up, but what Alaska does is they have an open primary where you get a single vote. It's an open primary, so anybody in any party gets to vote, and I think what that does is that incentivizes the candidates to not get nasty, not do the mudslinging. They've got to appeal to a broad spectrum of voters. And then the top 4 candidates move on. And the reason I like the top 4, because California also has an open primary, but the top 2 move on. And if you saw in the primary elections earlier this year in California, they could manipulate with the top 2 moving on, because the Democrat poured money into the Republican race so that the top 2 going out was a Republican and Democrat. But in a very, very blue state, guess who's going to win the general election? There is going to be no competition. So in Alaska, you have the top 4 move on, and then they're ranked choice. So when the top 4 move on to the general, and then you have the ranked choice, you still have to be able to appeal to a broad spectrum of voters to be able to truly get the best candidate coming out. So ranked choice voting, there's 2 types, and then within those 2 types, there's many different variations of it. And I do think the verdict is still out on the best one for the legislative body, but we can talk about more of that later. So actually, I'll go into it. So for the single winner, as you saw in the video, it's 50% plus 1. So if you have 4 candidates. If you have 4 candidates, and if whichever one in the first count, you're going to count everybody who's ranked their choice is number 1. If you get somebody that's over 50% plus 1, that one automatically wins. If you don't have 50% plus 1, the last place candidate is thrown out, and all of their second place votes are then redistributed until you get to somebody with 50% plus 1. For the legislative body, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Once you know how many seats you're going to fill, so if you're running for a race with 3 open seats, 25% plus 1 is going to be the threshold. And so the first time you count everybody, if you have a candidate with 25% plus 1, that candidate wins. But here's where it starts to get a little mixed up. So hang with me here. I'm gonna go into the next. Okay, so there's different variations of how you can count this. So you see in the first column, this is for a race for 3 open seats, which the threshold is 25% plus 1. The first column, in the first vote, when you voted for everybody, your number 1 choice, the first candidate won. And so now here are the different variations of how you can count it. They would take the surplus and then redistribute the surplus. And so back in 1925, when Cincinnati did proportional representation, I'm really glad we've gotten better than this. What they would do is they would just take that surplus and then take them in the order and redistribute them whatever order they had them. And so I don't necessarily know if I feel like that can be manipulated a little bit. Now it's a little bit different. So what they do, I'm gonna give you some math here. So you have 9,200 voters, and the threshold for 3 seats is 25%. So that's 2,300 votes. So candidate A gets 2,500 votes. So she has 200 surplus votes. The 200 surplus votes count as 8% of the total votes that she got. So one theory is to weight those surplus votes by 8%. So they're going to take all of candidate A's number 2 votes and redistribute them and count them out. So 1,250 of candidate A's number 2 votes went to candidate B. But we need to weight that because we're not going to give them all because we already counted the 2,300 votes already to get to the 20. Am I still, people still tracking here? No? Okay, okay. So you have the surplus votes, and what they did in the old days in Cincinnati when they had proportional representation, once they counted to the amount that you needed to win, they would take all those extra votes, because rather than just keep piling up all those extra votes, then so many of them don't need to count because you only needed so many to get on council. What they would do is they would just take those pile of ballots and just redistribute them to the number 2 for all the extras. And so it depended on which extras they took of how those would be distributed, because your number 2 vote may be different from my number 2 vote and different from your number 2 vote and different from your number 2 vote. But if they only took your number 2 votes and redistributed them and not ours, you could have a totally different election.
Yeah.
Totally different election. So what they decided, so what has evolved over the last 100 years is looking at it in a different way, where they would just weight. Like you take the percentage of surplus that they have and then multiply that by that percent for when you redistribute it. So every vote's being counted, but it's being weighted by how many extra votes they actually had to redistribute. We're still tracking now? All right. And then that would continue. So they would do that for the top vote getter, and then the second place, and then they would redistribute for all of candidate A who already won, all of their surplus, and certain number of surplus, and weighted to redistribute those. Then they would remove the last place, toss them out, and then redistribute all of those votes to make sure that last place person votes actually got counted. So what this means is that if in a plurality contest where you have a single winner and 1 vote per winner, if you voted for somebody who has the overwhelming majority of votes, your vote may not necessarily count because they have way more than enough votes that they needed. But if you also felt very strongly to vote for somebody who has no chance at winning whatsoever, your vote doesn't necessarily count either. But in this case, what it means is that your vote is going to count no matter what, because your vote is either going to help the candidate who wins to get to that threshold to win, or it's going to be then given your number 2 vote to go to a different candidate that you also like. If you voted for the person who has no shot at winning, but you felt such a strong conviction that you wanted to vote for them, and they're never going to win, when they get tossed, your number 2 vote is going to go to a different candidate, or your number 3 vote is going to go to a different candidate. So no matter what, your vote is actually counted in this version. So there are other variations of this too, where they don't take that surplus and they just toss out the last place and then redistribute those similar to the single winner voting. So this is a bit of a rub in the political science world of which variation is the best one to use. And this will be interesting going forward to figure out. I think there's still a lot of studies out there to determine which one is the best one. The one that I'm explaining here is becoming the most popular version. But stay tuned.
Anything is better than a single vote.
Yeah, there you go.
Could you explain again, on candidate A there that has the surplus votes, you said they're weighted. Weighted by what? What?
So it's the percentage. So I'm gonna...
Of excess that they have?
The excess that they have. So whatever this is, whatever percentage of their total votes that this is, when they redistribute these to the second place, if they redistribute all of them, they're counting these votes twice. So you don't want to count it for 100% of the total. So what it is it's the percentage of excess votes that they no longer needed because they already hit the surplus. So say it's 100 votes and it's 8% of their total votes, you're going to move over 8 votes. Say this is not 100 votes, but pretend this is 100 votes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then they do it, they'll do the top 3 and then they'll drop the bottom 3 until you get the right amount, is that method. So there's different methods and they're very complicated. But that one is the one that's trending in popularity at this point. But this is only for a legislative body where there's multiple winners. When it's a single winner, they just drop the bottom and redistribute, drop the bottom, redistribute until you get somebody who hits the threshold. So right now, we have someone in our front row here wearing this shirt, collecting signatures to show support. But Rank the Vote Ohio is actually looking at putting ranked choice voting on Ohio's ballot in the coming future. I am not a part of this group, so I don't know which variation they're going to choose, so I'm not up here endorsing them. I just want you to be aware of that this is going on. It's currently active in the state, and they're looking to put it on the ballot in the coming years. And I think it's important that you start to look them up, better understand the different variations of ranked choice voting, because they're going to be circulating petitions soon. Once they determine which method they want to use, they'll be putting it on the ballot and having people who are really well informed. There is the opposition to ranked choice is that it is way too complicated and voters don't understand. But if you go back into when you understand the complexity of how you actually count the vote, I think that's a fair criticism. But when you look at the way it's actually on the ballot, if grade school kids know how to rank their favorite colors, we know that voters can go and understand how to vote for their favorite candidates. And we can see through the history of the city how well it works to be able to get fair representation to make sure everyone is represented. I will say that I wanted to share some other things that people talk about in favor and against ranked choice voting. People say that it ends gerrymandering. I disagree with that. I think you can still have that no matter what, so long as you have districts. However, this pushes and incentivizes the candidates to appeal to everyone versus just their base to be able to win in a district where they're heavily favored. And the reason is because if you're not going to be someone's number 1, you want to be their number 2. Because there is a very strong chance that some of their votes are going to be redistributed. And if you're the number 2 and you spend your entire, or if you want to be their number 2, but you spent the entire time mudslinging, you are not going to be their number 2 and you have a really hard time being able to win. So it ends up being much more positive elections, much more focused on actual policy versus just tearing down the other candidates. And it helps, I think, voters stay far more informed versus just constant hatred for the other side, whereas you might not necessarily know what the other side stands for, except for how the person that hates them the most define them. Another outcome that I tend to like, because this is where I stand on the political spectrum, more moderates tend to win. It does tend to weed out a lot of the extremists. So I want to go back to Charlie Taft's quote because I think it's important now that we're looking at this situation again today, and this is something that's being considered in Ohio. There's hardly a supporter of the city charter committee today who does not feel that proportional representation is the most important single element in the success of good government in the city, and it must be preserved at all costs. So Rank the Vote Ohio, because we are in a home rule state, Rank the Vote Ohio would only impact state and federal elections. It would not impact local elections. So it would be up to the charter committee to do work to put this on the ballot or look at changing the charter again. It was tried in 1991 and it failed 55-45. But it's 100 years later after the first time that we saw this happen, so who knows? And so we need to do what we can to make sure we continue to have good government, good governance, and hopefully get recognized again as the best governed city in the United States. So thank you. And to not Q&A, I will do my best, but I'm also going to get some help by some of our experts. Yes.
You say it will reduce mudslinging, et cetera. Is that theoretical or proven?
In a lot of states, they say it is. I think it's both theoretical and proven. It incentivizes candidates to do less of going after other candidates because you want to be their number 2 or their number 3.
And that's been
You
seen
have to be.
happen in other jurisdictions where they use it.
And which is why it ends up weeding out some of the extremists who do not know how to collaborate and start to, work well with people who are very different ideologically.
You keep talking about ranked voting, and then you get proportional representation. Let's go back to 1957. What did it look like in Cincinnati?
It was the proportional representation of that version. So proportional representation is a variation of ranked choice voting. Ranked choice is what it is called today. However, there are some areas that do proportional representation even differently, where they take the voter makeup and they say automatically this many seats have to go to this party, this many seats have to go to this party, this many seats go to this party. So there are many different definitions of it. I'm using it the way it was written in the charter, where it was basically ranked choice voting. It just wasn't called ranked choice voting then.
So Ted Berry lost because he may have gotten some first place votes, but so many people gave him the last choice.
Before he was elected mayor, I believe they changed the type of voting to block him from becoming mayor. Then he became, Steve's my historian there.
Yes, no, that's correct. That's my recollection, is that they did change. He was ultimately, you recall, mayor was the top vote getter overall.
No, the mayor at that time.
The mayor was
The mayor was elected by the council.
Yeah.
And so if you could stop Ted Berry from finishing in the top 9, there was no way he could become the mayor. And that's what
But
happened.
how did they get him out? I mean, they'd have to say that he got the least votes.
Change the method.
Kind of a racist.
No, I can understand. When he was on council, he wouldn't get elected. But in 1957, he ran, and how he finished.
No, he lost. He left council after the first election that went back to winner takes all. He was elected every time that he ran under proportional representation. Once the voters accepted removing PR from the city charter, the next election Ted Berry lost. That's what happened. He never lost under PR.
I just want to say it took 5 elections to get it overruled. And they had the final vote was in August of the year, and not many people were there, and not many people turned out for that particular election, and they finally defeated it.
So
You mean to get
it's-
PR off,
To get PR off, to defeat PR.
to 5 elections.
Hmm.
See, that was still.
Go ahead.
Yes.
There always seems to have been an undercurrent with the Cincinnati City Council elections, with people saying we ought to go to districts as opposed to 9 at-large seats, or some combination of the two. We in the state of Ohio are going through that right now somewhat with the setting of districts. And once you go to districts, there's always the battle over where the district lines are placed. I'm interested in, if anybody knows, prior to 1924, where there were 32 wards.
26 wards.
What's that?
26 wards.
26 wards. How those ward lines were determined, and were individuals within the ward only able to vote for representation within the ward?
So-
Plus the at-large candidates.
I believe they could only vote for those in the ward, but I do know, I don't know how they were drawn, but I do know that they didn't necessarily live in there, so in the ward. So the political machine would just distribute where they wanted their candidates to be, who they thought could just pull the most votes in those sections, so they could get their people in office, which is a huge problem. I think Ted Berry had a really, really good quote regarding wards and not wanting to ever go back to that, is because he said it forces candidates to actually have to appeal to the whole city and better understand every neighborhood of our city. We have 52 incredible neighborhoods in our city, and if you're only running for one district, one ward, you're not getting to know, and when you make decisions, you are making it based on who's voting for you and what's going to make them happy versus the betterment of the entire city, and I could not agree more with him on that.
And I think it was Charlie Taft that said that after the 1924 government change, that was the shot heard round the wards.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Under the system you described, if things came out close and you had to have a recount, would you get the same answer?
So it's interesting because they actually, way a lot of the experts in this call it having like runoff elections with recounts, because you're taking the second place and you're running off the candidates that are left after someone hit the threshold and recounting. But you can't redo it and do a different methods and get the same answer, and that's why it's going to be critical to decide when the Rank the Vote Ohio, when they decide which method they want to put on the ballot. Now, granted, for state and federal elections in Ohio, it is just a single winner, so it's going to be the same where it's 50% plus one, and the last place are dumped, and then those votes are redistributed. When you get to the local municipalities, you're going to have more field races, and that's going to be a very big debate on which method you choose for those local areas and which one's the best one.
Could you put the slide from the count back on there? Yeah. There was an actual...
You'll need a mic, I think.
Yeah.
Here.
In direct response to your question, there was an actual recount in the 1950s under PR, and there was something like 100,000 votes. And something went wrong, and they had to reshuffle the deck and do another count. They did an actual recount, and out of 100,000 votes, there was no change in the order of the winners.
Do you have your phone in your pocket or something?
That's all right. This is a little word.
Okay. And there was no change in the order of the winners. The same 9 candidates won, and the total vote count, I think there were about 11 differences in the totals of the votes. But also, I wanted to mention in the time that we had PR, the way that the surpluses were transferred, it was not just take the last ballots that came in and transfer those, which would possibly skew the results. The ballots were randomized so that if 1/8 of the total for a particular candidate was surplus, then every 8th ballot was numbered, and from the bottom to the top, not just take it off the top. It was randomized, and that's what resulted in fair elections and not manipulable by vote counters or dependent on which precincts came in last. So it was a fair system.
Do we have any other questions? Somebody back, I saw, wait, there's somebody that hasn't, I'm not discriminating against you yet, but somebody else. Go ahead.
I have a question about, you said that all the proposals for statewide ranked choice would be single district as opposed to multi-district, like in countries like Ireland? Is that, if it's a constitutional amendment, could you not adjust that, I guess?
It's not final. Again, I'm not part of the group, so I don't know what their internal discussions are of what they're going to choose. But they, from my understanding, I've been to several of their presentations, so that's why I brought them up, because I know they're active in this. But they have not decided what method or how much overhaul. I mean, they could go to an Alaska model with an open primary and then a ranked choice general. They could do what you're talking about. They could do any of that. I have no idea what their internal discussions are, but the other thing that they'd also have to play around with in Ohio, it's state law that any of these ballot measures have to be single subject. And so I don't know, I'm also not an attorney, but I don't know if there could be a legal challenge there that those are two separate things and they'd have to have two separate ballot initiatives, or if you could do it in one overhaul. I'm not sure. I know that was a non-answer, but there's options.
Somebody else in the back had a question? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming out and speaking today.
Thanks for being here.
Your idea of having the system on the ballot at both the state and local level is interesting. It seems to me that the only honest argument a political party can make against ranked choice voting is that it makes it harder for them to have an unfair advantage. And obviously, they're not going to say that, so they're going to tell you all kinds of other things to just try to scare people away from trying something different. So since you work for the chamber, I wonder if you could explain what you think the case for the business community to support ranked choice voting would be if they have to take a position on that, and if you would be making that case to them.
Well, I'd be making the case to them when it's actually on the ballot and we know what method they choose and all that. And the way the chamber decides to take stances on it is we have an executive committee, a government affairs executive committee, and we will pull in, we're actually doing it coming up on the redistricting ballot, and we will have somebody come speak in favor of it and someone come speak against it, and we will have debates and lots of questions, and we will decide, do we know enough to vote for a stance? Do we have enough to decide that we don't, or not enough that we don't want to take a stance, or we want to engage, not engage, or we want to come back and have more people come in and talk about it. So it's a really long, drawn out process with a lot of our members, because the chamber has thousands of members. So and they're all represented on, not individual companies are represented here, but they're considered represented with this executive committee that votes on it to decide. If I were to take more of an objective stance, not necessarily talk about the chamber right now, because I think I'd get in trouble if I say this is what I would pitch and where we stand. We haven't discussed this yet. But I think at the end of the day, you end up getting more moderate and or collaborative candidates out of a model like this, because you have to be able to appeal to so many voters, because you're not just going for a one vote, you're going for maybe somebody who doesn't agree with you on everything but their number 2 vote, and somebody over here you disagree with but you want their number 3 vote. And if you can be collaborative on the campaign trail and you can talk to people with different ideologies and convince them that they can still believe in you, I think that shows collaboration, that shows effective governance. And that shows people who can govern in the right way, so you're making decisions for the best of the community. And at the end of the day, when we have a strong economy and we have jobs and we can help people with economic mobility to be able to move up in life, that means your government is working very, very well.
So, all right, one more question. Marilyn, you get the final, you don't get the final word, you get the final question.
Have you all looked at this from a candidate's perspective? I mean, isn't it going to change entirely the way candidates campaign?
Totally. I mean, I think right now the system really benefits those who just appeal to a small base and really can just be the loudest and get the most headlines to get the name recognition to get on the ballot. It totally changes the way you need to campaign, because you have to appeal to so many other people, because you're not just campaigning towards the person who is already gonna, I mean, I was the only, we'll use me as an example. If we were on there, I being the only Republican, the vast majority of Republicans are gonna vote for me no matter what. I've got to spend the time now to make sure that not just the moderates or the slightly left Dems, but even the much further left Dems are interested in me as their number 2 or their number 3 to ensure that I get on. Granted, I did that anyway because I needed those votes because we only had 15% of the city, but I think it changes. And for Democrats, if you have that many running and they're not guaranteed that many seats because they don't have the supermajority anymore, they're going to have to appeal to the other side.
So, thank you, Liz.
Thank you.